of Martha Katz-Hyman, who will begin first. She is currently the curator.
Well, not the curator.
Not a curator.
She is She is a curator at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. For 20 years, she served as an assistant curator at Colonial Williamsburg, and she's seemingly extremely proud of her work for the Slave Carter's Grove Slave Quarter that was there from 1989 to 2002. And she's also co-editor of a 2-volume encyclopedia called World of a Slave that was published by ABC Clio in 2010. After Martha Katz-Hyman, we will have Tiara Davis, who is a Honors College senior history major at Norfolk State University, and her area of focus is African American Studies. And lastly, we will have Rebecca Hoover, who is a professor of American Literature at Virginia Wesleyan College. So without further ado, we'll begin with Martha Katz-Hyman.
Good afternoon. We are all surrounded by the stuff of daily life. Dishes from which we eat, beds on which we sleep, clothing that we wear, electronic gadgets with which we communicate. We may not like doing the dishes or washing the sheets or answering the stream of emails or text messages, but we accept these less than desirable aspects of this stuff because these things, this material culture, brings us benefits that outweigh the annoyances that having them bring. And in some cases, we declare that we just can't live our lives without having these things around us. Enslaved men and women were surrounded by stuff too, and the majority of it, furniture, tools, clothing, ceramics, cooking equipment, and more, was the property of their owners. But slaves had their own stuff as well. The clothing they wore, the food they ate, and yes, the things that they made and purchased for themselves. The goods that they wore, worked with, and purchased came out of the Anglo-European traditions of their owners, and in style and form became familiar to them as our own material surroundings are to us. But what of those things that seem to be Anglo-European or American but aren't quite? What made these things different, and how were they different? And how is it that despite legal prohibitions against owning property, enslaved men and women, themselves property of somebody else, developed a material environment that met their own physical and spiritual needs? These questions were long debated by curators, interpreters, archaeologists, and historians, and they seem to have no good answers. Despite the disregard with which many scholars treated the subject, African Americans themselves knew that in fact their enslaved ancestors did possess a rich material heritage. In his groundbreaking book, The Myth of the Negro Past, published in 1941, anthropologist Melville Herskovitz argued persuasively that African traditions continue to influence African American cultural behaviors. However, mainstream academic acknowledgement of this fact did not begin to change until almost 25 years later, when the late Charles Fairbanks, a University of Florida archaeologist, and the late Robert Asher, a professor of anthropology at Cornell, described the results of the excavation of a Georgia slave cabin in an innovative article in the journal Historical Archaeology in 1971. It was one of the first scholarly discussions of a slave site, and is regarded as the beginning of archaeologists' interest in the lives of the enslaved men and women who comprised the majority of the Southern workforce from the late 17th century through the Civil War. Almost 10 years later, in 1979, Dr. William Kelso, now renowned for his work at historic Jamestown, expanded on excavations that had begun 20 years earlier along Monticello's Mulberry Row, finding rich deposits of a variety of objects used by the enslaved men and women who labored for Thomas Jefferson and his family. In Williamsburg, excavations at Carter's Grove, Kings Mill, Utopia, Rich Neck, Southall's Quarter near Quarterpath Road, Chiswick Watch, and other sites continue to reveal the varied material lives of Virginia's enslaved population. And discovery at sites like the Lee family's Stratford Hall give us new insights into the lives of the enslaved. When I first came to colonial Williamsburg in 1985, I knew little about slavery in the 18th century Chesapeake and even less about its material culture. My background was in colonial New England history and American Jewish history, and though I knew there were slaves in colonial New England, I'd really never given any thought to them in any way. But once I began my work at colonial Williamsburg, it wasn't long before I became involved in our effort to furnish spaces in the historic area that reflected the presence of slaves, and then in the path-breaking effort to furnish the reconstructed slave quarter at Carter's Grove. As I learned more about slavery in Williamsburg and the Chesapeake, and how it was very different from what I had learned in high school and college, I realized that I had a lot of questions with no easy answers. I read a lot of period probate inventories, and most of them included slaves, but not their clothing, utensils, or work tools. It was perfectly logical that the people themselves were listed, but where was everything else? I looked at assemblages of objects excavated from known slave quarters sites and asked what made these things part of a slave's material culture, and why would slaves have keys, buttons, and Chinese export plates anyhow? I studied store accounts and saw that slaves appeared by name as holders of credit accounts. But how was it that they could sell their labor and their goods they made and buy things for themselves and still be slaves? I read diaries and letters, read how slave owners purchased blankets and clothing for their slaves, read what slave owners thought about these people that they owned, and asked, if these slave owners cared about these people in some way, why were they not freed? And I read accounts of visitors to the Chesapeake as they tried to make some sense of the slave society they observed and the enslaved people with whom they came in contact, briefly describing what they saw, but often not understanding what they observed about slave life and slave material culture. And I wondered how it would ever be possible to convey all of this information to visitors who knew only the barest facts about slaves and slavery in the 18th century, who came with preconceived notions of what slavery was, and more likely than not, wanted to avoid discussing the topic altogether. For many people, the notion that enslaved people slept in beds, lived in houses with wood floors, cooked with a variety of equipment, and wore clothing that spanned the range from coarse linen shirt and trousers for work in the fields to dresses of printed cotton or suits of fine livery may seem strange. After all, being a slave implies that someone owns not only your physical body, but also anything else that you might have, from the clothing you wear, to the food you put in your mouth, to the bed you sleep in, whatever that bed might be, to the utensils you cook with. It implies a material status so low that only the most basic of food, shelter, and clothing is provided. Yet the evidence we have, both archaeological and documentary, shows time and time again that slaves in the 18th and 19th centuries lived within a fairly wide range of material levels, from those who truly did have only the most basic necessities of life, to those who managed to acquire goods that were equal to or better than those that poor to middling whites could obtain. How did the enslaved accumulate these goods? Were they yet another facet of the negotiation between master and slave that characterized other aspects of enslavement? If slaves had no legal right to own these items, why were they not required to give them up to their owners? And if American slavery was not denoted by having few, if any, possessions of one's own, then how was it characterized? The last question is probably the easiest to answer. Simply that these people of African descent were slaves by virtue of laws enacted beginning in the 17th century that defined their status and reflected long-time prejudices, not because these laws dictated levels of material goods. The law said they were chattel, and the law provided the ways in which they could cease being slaves. Over time, these laws were modified, repealed, and reenacted. Sometimes they specified what slaves could or could not possess, like guns, liquor, or dogs. In these cases, the laws reflected what enslaved individuals actually did possess or had access to, and therefore what slave owners were unhappy about them possessing and wished to prohibit. But by and large, these laws were enacted to regulate behavior and legal status, not consumption. How slaves acquired goods is also relatively easy to answer. Because of the wealth of primary sources, letters, diaries, business records, legal records, runaway slave advertisements that provide the information, although almost none of this information, especially regarding slave life from 1619 to the first quarter of the 19th century, is from the enslaved. Slave owners issued clothing, blankets, and food on a semi-regular schedule. Clothing was issued in the spring or summer, and in fall and winter, or once a year on New Year's Day. Blankets usually in the fall, and food was distributed weekly as well as seasonally. It appears that there was a generally accepted minimum level of furnishings that slaveholders supplied to slaves and that slaves expected to receive, and that based on available documentation, once these goods were issued, masters as well as slaves considered these goods to be the slave's property. An enormous amount of time, energy, and money was spent by slave owners, especially those with rural plantations, to make sure that their enslaved workforce had proper clothing for each season and that this clothing was serviceable but obtained at the best price. Examining the account books of both merchants and craftsmen reveals the types of goods purchased in Tidewater, Virginia for slaves' use. Purchases of shoes, stockings, livery, hats, blankets, and tools for the use of slaves are commonly found in these account books. And the frequent use of the same descriptive terms for these goods, Negro shoes, plaid hose for Negroes, Negro cotton, indicates that these were common terms whose definition was well understood by all residents of the region. For example, correspondence between George Washington and one of his plantation overseers went on for months about blankets, blanket prices, differences in materials, and which slave would get which type of blanket. In Williamsburg, Thomas Everard wrote to John Norton, his agent in London, on February 10, 1773, and ordered, as you see here, the transcription, 4 greatcoats for Negroes, 2 for men about the house, and 2 for lads postilions. Joseph Ball, an uncle of George Washington who owned a plantation in Lancaster County, but lived in London, England in the 1740s, wrote often to his nephew and plantation administrator Joseph Chin with detailed instructions regarding the slaves on his plantations. In February 1744, he specified that each adult slave, quote, must have a good suit of the Welch plains, which is a type of inexpensive wool fabric, made as it should be, not too scanty nor bobtailed, and each must have 2 shirts or shifts of the osnabrids, which is linen. Yet once the clothing was given to a slave, it disappeared from the slave owner's inventory of goods. Whatever clothing or blankets a slave had at the time of the owner's death was not reflected in the probate inventories. Once clothing or blankets were given to slaves, these items were no longer perceived as being the slaveholder's property. The same was true for food. Notwithstanding the archaeological evidence that many enslaved people managed to procure a varied diet of meat, including pork, beef, and chicken, fish, vegetables, and fruit, and grains other than corn, many probate inventories listed only, quote, corn for the Negroes, and frequently owners specified in instructions to overseers and managers that slaves were to be given specific types and quantities of food. Joseph Ball wrote to Joseph Chin in 1734 specifying, quote, if there should be any sorry, that is kind of yucky looking lambs left, that you think not be worth killing for yourself, let them be killed for the Negroes. But let this all be done so prudently that the Negroes may have fresh meat when they are sick, if the time of year will allow of it. In 1767, Landon Carter wrote in his diary, note, we took out this day 16 bushels of eared corn from the Mangorite corn house to make the people's allowance. Slaveholders were concerned that their slaves be adequately supplied, but again, once they had distributed the food, they felt they had fulfilled their duty, and what happened to the food itself was no longer their responsibility. They ceased to regard it as their property. For example, in 1787, an enslaved member of the Waterlick Baptist Church in Shenandoah County was accused of selling his owner's bacon. The slave initially denied the charge, but then stated that, quote, what he sold was his own property, given to him by his master for his own private use, and that he sold it in pity to the buyer. That an enslaved man would say that the bacon was his own property would seem to indicate that slave owners understood the ancient Roman principle of the peculium. This principle acknowledged that slaves were allowed to accumulate property, but that this property was subject to appropriation by the master at any time, even though in practice the appropriation of the goods may have happened infrequently, if ever. Thomas Jefferson understood the principle. In a letter to his son-in-law, Thomas Mann Randolph, in 1798, he thanked Randolph, quote, for putting an end to the cultivation of tobacco as the peculium of the Negroes. I have ever found it necessary to confine them to such articles as are not raised on the farm. There is no other way of drawing a line between what is theirs and mine. Jefferson thus acknowledged that his slaves were able to grow certain crops and accumulate property, whether it be goods or money, but he also did not hesitate to assert his right to prevent his slaves' acquisition of goods when that acquisition threatened his own livelihood. But understanding the concept of the peculium underlines why the goods that slaves owned did not appear in their owners' probate inventories. Once this clothing and food were issued to their enslaved workforce, slaveholders no longer considered it their own property, and it was not considered the property of the deceased for purposes of probate. Hard concept to get your head around. Slaveholders also supplied slaves with the tools necessary to do their jobs, although these remain the property of the master and are the items most likely to be found listed in probate inventories of slaveholders as the properties of the deceased's estate. Not surprisingly, they are the items that were most often listed in advertisements as having been taken by escaped slaves, such as Ben, who, quote, took sundry carpenters' and coopers' tools when he fled Joshua Jones's York County plantation in March 1770. These tools represented capital expenses necessary for the smooth operation of the household and plantation, and were the equivalent of today's tractor or combine, owned by the farmer and provided to the worker so that the job could be done quickly and efficiently. In brief, it is clear that Virginia's slave owners regarded the clothing and food they issued to the enslaved as the slave's personal property, despite the fact that private ownership by slaves was legally forbidden. Whether slaveholders thought that these issues had any value to themselves is not known. What is known is that these items ceased to be regarded as the slaveholder's property once they were given to the slave. Supplies, the tools necessary for these enslaved workers to do their jobs, never became the slave's property, and thus never lost their value to the slaveholder. They, therefore, can be found in probate inventories and in tax documents and lease agreements, where even old and broken equipment is valued. Although not well documented, some slaves received hand-me-down cooking utensils, furniture, and clothing from their owners. Joseph Ball instructed Joseph Chin in 1749 to give, quote, the gray coat, waistcoat, and breeches with brass buttons, and the hat to poor Will, the stuff shirt to Mingo, stuff is a kind of fabric, and Aaron's old livery to Moses. This, however, was not a usual practice. They also picked up items discarded by whites, repaired them, and put them to their own purposes. They obtained goods by theft, usually from their owners, a crime for which, if discovered, they were punished and sometimes legally prosecuted. That many slaveholders or overseers kept a close eye on the tools and supplies used by their enslaved workers, scrutinized their return carefully, and kept them under lock and key suggests that stealing was a widespread problem. On the other hand, enslaved individuals understandably displayed little remorse over these appropriations, thinking perhaps that they had earned these items. In 1793, George Washington acknowledged the trade in stolen goods between the enslaved and poor whites when he tried to prevent the daughter of his white former carpenter from going into business, as he feared, quote, her shop would be no more than a receptacle for stolen produce by the Negroes. He knew that without this source of cheap goods, poor whites would be unable to live upon the miserable land they occupied. And since I only have about 2 more minutes to talk, here is an example of a slave who took fabric with him and bribed the ship that he had been working on so they would be silent. Slaves made things and sold them. They grew their own produce, and they acquired goods from their own labor. They sold these things to their own owners. Francis Taylor, who lived in Orange County, writes in his diary of buying things from his slave. Produce, chickens, everything. Slaves in urban settings were hired out. Many of them, like in Charleston, which had the most developed system of this hiring out system, were actually able to keep some of the money for themselves. With cash accumulated over many years, some slaves hoped to buy their freedom or that of family members. Some of them used that money, however, to purchase goods, like in this credit account from Negro Jack, who over 9 years bought rum and fabric, wine glasses, and a plane iron, and all did it on credit and barter. But at the same time, memories and traditions of Africa clearly provided a critical element that shaped enslaved material culture over several generations. And what we find is that slaves are taking the objects that they have and using them for the purposes that they need them. Either pierced coins, crystals placed under floors, pierced spoon handles like this one here, clearly, deliberately chopped off here. African and using pierced shells that had natural piercings, coins, crystals. These are from Annapolis, pins here, crystals and coins, and a bowl, and what may be a cosmogram symbol on the underneath of a pipe, a smoking pipe. But even African elements we see in music, song, dance, cooking, traditions, hair wraps, and even storytelling. And for those of you who go to Hampton University, yes, this is Dr. Watson many years ago. But we still have difficulty in understanding the environment in which slaves lived and worked, the material goods they used in their everyday lives, and how these objects were arranged within a particular living or working area, especially because there are almost no period visual sources to illustrate them. We do have what appears initially to be an excellent description of a slave quarter by the same Julian Niemczewicz, and here's just some other. Here's Julian Niemczewicz, who visited Mount Vernon in 1798, and he wrote, "We entered one of the huts of the blacks, for one cannot call them by the name of houses. They are more miserable than the most miserable of the cottages of our peasants. The husband and wife sleep on a mean pallet, the children on the ground. a very bad fireplace, some utensils for cooking, but in the middle of this poverty, some cups and a teapot. A very small garden planted with vegetables was close by, with 5 or 6 hens, each one leading 10 to 15 chickens. It is the only comfort that is permitted them, for they may not keep ducks, geese, or pigs. They sell the poultry in Alexandria and procure for themselves a few amenities. What are we to make of this? Were what Mientkiewicz calls a hut and what we call a hut the same thing? What is a mean pallet? Does the fact that Mientkiewicz describes the children as sleeping on the ground mean that the husband and wife slept off the ground in a bed of some kind? What were the utensils for cooking, and what kind of cups and a teapot did he see? He was obviously told, either by Washington or one of the overseers, that the slaves sold their chickens in Alexandria, but what kind of amenities did they purchase? What would a slave consider an amenity? Can we ever answer these questions and then transform them into environments in which we can interpret the lives of the enslaved? Some museum visitors, when they've gone to Carter's Grove or Mount Vernon, Stratford Hall, will think that these enslaved people did not live that badly, especially considering the fact that, almost at the end. But this is, okay, but this is really the most important part of it. And even though these men and women may have lived in material environments that superficially do not look that terrible, especially when you compare them to the material environments of free, poor, white, or free black people, but you have to think about the observation of Isaac Weld, an English traveler in Virginia in 1795-96, who wrote, "Let the condition of a slave be made ever so comfortable, as long as he is conscious of being the property of another man, who has it in his power to dispose of him according to the dictates of caprice, as long as he hears people about him talking of the blessings of liberty and considers that he is in a state of bondage, it is not to be supposed that he can feel equally happy with the freeman. It is immaterial under what form slavery presents itself. Whenever it appears, there is ample cause of humanity to weep at the sight and to lament that men can be found so forgetful of their own situations as to live regardless of the feelings of their fellow creatures. In furnishing slave quarters and free black homes, we can only guess how those items were arranged in these spaces by the people who lived and worked there. Unknown are the alternative uses and meanings that these individuals found in iron pots, mirrors, pins, buttons, spoons, bowls, and cups, or the meanings assigned to these objects, whether as talisman or adornment, utilitarian or decorative, treasure or trash, for there is no one correct answer. There is no one-size-fits-all history. What may be true in one place and at one time is not necessarily the case in other times and other places. There's yeah.
I know you worked really hard.
I know.
We have to be out by 3:15, and it's.
Oh yeah. I could talk forever about this.